What's up everybody, welcome back to Totally Exposed.
Yeah, it's quite a nice day today, so we thought we'd come out and shoot some time lapses.
Yeah, and that kind of got us thinking, have you ever tried to shoot time lapses and, well, you thought, I'd like to give that a go, but I haven't got a clue where to start, or maybe you've had a go and you've not been too chuffed with how it came out? Well, seeing as we're going to be shooting some today, should we share our top tips that we use
we should, yeah.
Shooting time lapses?
Well, we've got quite a lot to get through, so should we get cracking?
Let's do this.
Let's do this.
So you might be wondering what a time-lapse even is. And if you are, well, you're actually watching one right now. This is a time-lapse that we shot when myself and Neil and a few other mates were last in Las Vegas. Now, what it isn't, a time-lapse definitely isn't just sped up video like I've heard some people describe it. I mean, it is in essence still just video because it is a set of images or frames that are switching a set number of times per second like a video does. But with time-lapse, what you get to do is you get to decide how much of a gap in time there is between each one of those frames that are being taken. As a result, you get these awesome visuals that help show the passing of time in a really interesting way. I absolutely love them. Let's find out more about making them. So we've come here today to Warwick to do our time-lapse. We've got the nice Warwick Castle over here in the background. The first thing you want to really consider about your time-lapse is obviously what do you want to do a time-lapse of. Now you need to have, as we talked about a minute ago, the sense of motion or the passing of time. So you have to have something, you know, with something going on. This is still quite peaceful. There's not loads going on in the scene that we've picked here today, but there are boats going up the river, and if the clouds were to break a little bit, you might see them going across the sky. I think this is a good first step that we're going to use for our time-lapse. So you've picked your spot, which we've done here. Let's talk about equipment. So you're definitely going to need two things. Thing number one, obviously a camera. Thing number two, a tripod. Now the next thing you're going to need is some way of automating your camera being able to take a photograph every X amount of seconds. Now on this camera that we're using today, which is the Canon 5D Mark IV, that actually has that built into the software, which is pretty awesome. However, on other cameras like the one we're filming on, which is the Canon 1DX Mark II, unfortunately that doesn't have that functionality in the software, which is a bit weird. So you have to use something instead called an intervalometer. Now you can pick these up pretty cheap on Amazon. In fact, we'll leave a link to one or two in the description below. The official like Canon ones or the Nikon ones I think are a bit overpriced. I don't know why they're so expensive. So you can just pick up a nice kind of off-brand cheapo one and it will work just fine. The final thing you're going to need ideally, although you don't actually have to have one, but I think it makes for a better time-lapse, is one of these, an ND filter. If you don't know what an ND filter is, it's essentially like some sunglasses for your camera, and that will allow us to block out a lot of the light, which is what we're going to need to do to kind of get longer exposure on each of our images, and we'll talk about that next. Now the first thing that I'll mention before we do anything is if you shoot in JPEG normally for some reason, I would highly recommend just on this occasion switching it up and shooting in RAW instead. It will just give you so much more flexibility when you put this into post-production later on. Definitely recommend shooting in RAW for this. So I'm going to set up my composition. Now I'm going to shoot this time-lapse totally all in manual settings. Now I normally use manual settings anyway for taking most photography, but from this time-lapse it's going to be entirely in manual settings. If we were doing more like a day to night type thing, then I'd probably be inclined to use aperture priority mode. However, our light isn't going to be changing for the period of this time-lapse, it's going to be in daytime. So manual mode, I should start by setting the camera in manual mode. Next up, you want to lock off your aperture. Now, nice kind of scene like this, a landscape style scene, I'm going to pick an aperture of f/6, so I'm going to just dial that in now. So ISO, we'll talk about that. It's a nice bright day. We don't want to kind of introduce any noise unnecessarily, so I'm going to put that as low as it will go, which is the base ISO of this camera, ISO 100. You definitely don't want autofocus on because you don't want each image shifting a little bit. So we're going to turn that off on the lens itself. I'm going to switch that to manual focus. This lens doesn't have any stabilization on it, but if you did have stabilization on your lens, you'd also want to turn that off as well. You just want every image to be as consistent as possible for the best results. I've got my white balance locked off. I don't want auto white balance, so I've put that to daylight for here, and I'm going to take a shot at this settings. Okay, so I'm not totally happy with my composition. I might move it across a little bit, but it's worth saying that you don't have to be totally spot on with your composition when you're doing these things, because the images that you're taking here are 6,000, well on this camera anyway, 6,000 by 4,000 images, and even when you put that onto a 4K timeline, that gives you a lot of room to be able to crop in and straighten out and do whatever you want to do. So obviously you want to get it as close as you can, but I'm pretty happy with that. The trouble is, at this shutter speed, which is 60th of a second, it's too fast. And what happens when you have a shutter speed that's too fast on a time lapse is it looks a bit kind of staccato, which is not the kind of effect that I like to go for. I prefer to have a shutter speed of at least half a second. If I were to dial that in, however, we're at half a second, you can see that that image is just total bright white, no good. This is where the ND filter comes into play. So I'm going to just put the ND filter on and we'll dial in the exposure with this on the lens instead. So what I've actually gone for here then, in the final settings, I've gone for a 1 second exposure, f5.6, ISO 100, everything else off. All the autofocus is off, all the white balance is just set manually to daylight, everything's off. So we're in a good place now to set up the actual intervalometer side of the time lapse. Now this will actually give you the option then of saying how many shots do you want to be able to take in total, and what interval do you want to leave it between each shot being taken. This is where you need to get your calculator out perhaps, or maybe an app, because this is where you need to use your brain. So we're in the UK obviously, and most of our video seems to be 25 frames per second, so for argument's sake we're going to stick with 25 frames per second, which means that you need 25 images for each second of time lapse that you want to be able to create. Now let's say that I wanted to create a 20-second time lapse. That means I need 500 images, okay? If I were to have a 1 second exposure, and let's say that I took a photo every 3 seconds, that means that 1,500 seconds will pass by the time that I've managed to capture enough data to fulfill a 20-second time lapse, which then means that's about 25 minutes. So, if you hadn't already gathered, this is not a fast process. You need to take your time. It's going to take a while to capture the information, but yeah, 25 minutes. So, based on that, I'm going to dial in the settings. Interval, I'm going to dial that down to every 3 seconds, okay? And then where it says number of shots, I'm going to set that to unlimited, and we'll just keep an eye on it ourselves, and we'll kind of let it run for about half an hour and then we'll turn it off. And here we go. And now we wait. So we'll check out how that one came out. Hopefully it was all right. We had a lot of boats that came in and kind of twirled around a bit and came back out again. And then whilst we're having a look at that, we'll walk to another location. Let's see what else we can take a photo of, a time lapse of. Let's do this. So we've walked up into town, It's thirsty work, this time-lapse malarkey, so we thought we'd come for a cheeky bit of refreshment. Now that is something we didn't touch on before about when you're doing these time-lapses. You are stood for quite some time, half an hour if not more, in a particular place. So you need to remember to bring water, maybe some snacks, or in this case you can enjoy a nice refreshing beer. Now why don't we try and do a time-lapse whilst we're here at the pub? Be an interesting one. We're just going to sit still, we'll hopefully catch all the movement of the people behind us, and we'll replenish our alcohol stocks. Okay, so we've actually moved on now to Leamington. We're in Jefferson Gardens in Leamington Spa. We've picked this spot, it's got some nice trees, it's got some nice waterfall, and there's some people milling around in the park as well. So we'll be able to set up our shot here, I think, to try and get another time lapse. Now, I don't want to sound boring or repetitive, but I'm going to reiterate the steps whilst we're here. So, step number one, I'm going to make sure that my image stabilization is off and my focus is set to manual. We're on ISO 100, f5.6, and we're still on a 1 second exposure. And I've got my ND still on so I can adjust the exposure to suit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a test image. There we go, that's 1 second, then I'll review it. Right, that's a bit bright. So let's dial in a little bit more ND, and I'll try another photo. That's a 1 second exposure, and that exposure looks a lot better to me. So that's all cool. We're going to go back to the settings for the time-lapse intervalometer settings. There we go. I'm going to enable that, and we're going to have 3 seconds again. We're going to run it for about half an hour and see what we get. Okay, ready? Off she goes. So we're about halfway through our time lapse, it's still chugging away. And I forgot, it's worth mentioning as well, if you have a little recorder like this little Zoom, or maybe you've just got your phone or whatever you've got with you, I recommend just grab some ambient sound from the location that you're doing your time lapse at, because I think when you actually get into post-production and you've made your time lapse, having some ambient sound to perhaps put over the top gives it that little extra something, I find.
Well, we've had fun out and about filming our time lapses, and well, I think they've turned out pretty well.
Yeah, they're pretty good, I think. So if you've been following along and you've been out, you've taken some time lapses, you've probably now got hundreds and hundreds of images, and you may be wondering, what do I do with them now? So if you want to see the next steps of the time lapse, so when we actually take it into post-production and make it into an amazing time lapse, then keep your eyes peeled, because we'll be releasing that video on this channel very soon.
Well, we hope you found this video helpful and it's inspired you to go out and try your own time lapses, and get creative with it, 'cause it's a great way to spend an afternoon. And I mean, the results are always worth more than the time it takes to set it up.
I agree.
And waiting around, but definitely get out there and give it a go.
They are great. So if this video was helpful, if you learned something from it, then give it a little like down below. That would be awesome. And if you've got any of your own kind of tips or tricks around time lapses, then put them in the comments down below. I mean, we read all the comments.
Yeah, we try to reply to many as we can.
We try to reply to loads of the comments, so do that as well. And if you want to be super awesome, then why not subscribe to the channel? Especially if you want to see the next video all about, like we said, the kind of post-production of the time lapse. Click the little bell icon and you'll be notified the moment that one comes out.
And we'll see you in the next one.
Absolutely. Peace.